What if I told you that the greatest love story I ever witnessed wasn't in any movie or novel, but hidden in a dusty shoebox in my grandmother's attic? What if I told you that the woman I thought I knew, the one who made Sunday dinners and never raised her voice, had lived through a passion and heartbreak so profound it would bring me to my knees? I found letters, dozens of them, and they changed everything I thought I knew about love, about sacrifice, and about the quiet strength that built my family. This is what I discovered. Before I begin my story, let me know in the comments where you are listening from and what time it is. I just want to know I'm not alone in this. And if you feel moved by what you hear, consider subscribing. It helps more people discover these true stories of love and resilience. Now let me tell you what really happened. The attic smelled like mothballs and memories. I stood at the top of the creaky stairs, looking at the chaos of my grandmother's life spread before me. Boxes of Christmas decorations, old furniture draped in white sheets like ghosts, and stacks of photo albums I knew I'd cry over later. Grandma Dorothy had passed 3 weeks earlier at the age of 97, and the task of sorting through her belongings had fallen to me, her oldest granddaughter. I wasn't ready for this. I don't think anyone ever is. My grandmother had been the cornerstone of our family. She was the one who held us together through births and deaths, celebrations and sorrows. She never complained, never asked for anything, and loved with a quiet fierceness that made you feel safe just being in the same room with her. But now she was gone, and I was left sifting through the remnants of a life well lived, trying to decide what to keep and what to let go. The morning light filtered through the small attic window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. I had been up here for 2 hours already, filling boxes with items for donation, and trying not to break down every time I found something that reminded me of her. A scarf she used to wear, a cookbook with her handwritten notes in the margins, a pin she wore to church every Sunday. I was in the far corner, behind an old wardrobe, when I saw it. A shoebox ordinary and unremarkable, pushed so far back against the wall that it was almost invisible. It was covered in dust, the cardboard soft with age, and tied shut with what had once been a white ribbon, but had faded to a yellowish cream. Something made me reach for it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was fate. I pulled the box toward me, leaving a trail in the dust, and sat down on the floor with my back against the wardrobe. My hands trembled slightly as I untied the ribbon. It fell away easily, as if it had been waiting for this moment. I lifted the lid. Letters. The box was full of letters. They were bundled together with more ribbons, some in better condition than others. The envelopes were thin and fragile, the kind of paper they used during the war when everything was rationed. I picked up the first bundle carefully, afraid they might crumble in my hands. The handwriting on the envelope was unmistakable. Even after all these years, I recognized my grandmother's elegant script, though it looked younger somehow less steady. The ink had faded to a soft brown and the postmark read August 14, 1943. My heart began to pound. I turned the envelope over and found another handwriting on the back. Masculine, bold, slightly messy. To my darling Dot with all my love. Jimmy, my grandfather. I had known my grandfather, of course. James Mitchell had died when I was 15, a quiet man who worked hard, loved his family, and never talked much about the war. He and Grandma had been married for 68 years, a partnership so steady and comfortable that I had always thought of their love as something calm and settled, like a river that had long since found its course. But these letters were from before all that. From when they were young, from when the world was at war and nothing was certain. I carefully slid the first letter from its envelope. The paper crackled softly and I held my breath as I unfolded it. The date at the top read August 10, 1943, and it began simply, "My dearest Dorothy." The words that followed were tender and awkward, the writing of a young man trying to express feelings he didn't quite have the vocabulary for. He wrote about basic training, about missing home, about counting the days until he could see her again. He told her about the other men in his unit, about the food they ate, about how he kept her photograph in his pocket and looked at it every night before he fell asleep. And then, at the end, "I know we haven't known each other long, Dot, but I need you to know that you're the reason I'll make it through this. You're what I'm fighting for. You're what I'm coming home to. Wait for me. Please wait for me." The tears blurred my vision. I wiped them away quickly and reached for another letter, then another. There were dozens of them, maybe 100, spanning years. Letters from my grandfather to my grandmother, and letters from my grandmother to my grandfather. A correspondence that chronicled their entire courtship, conducted across an ocean, through a war that threatened to tear them apart forever. I don't know how long I sat there reading. The sun moved across the sky, and the attic grew warm, but I couldn't stop. Each letter pulled me deeper into their story, into a world I had never known existed. These weren't the grandparents I remembered. These were Dorothy and Jimmy, Dot and her soldier. Two young people desperately in love in the most desperate of times. As I read, I began to see my grandmother differently. The woman I had known was strong and capable, but these letters revealed someone passionate and vulnerable. She wrote about her fears, her loneliness, her dreams for their future. She wrote about waiting, about hoping, about the unbearable weight of not knowing if the man she loved would ever come home. And my grandfather, quiet, stoic Grandpa Jim, wrote with a raw emotion that took my breath away. He was scared, he was homesick, he missed her so much it physically hurt. But through every letter, his love for her burned bright and unwavering. I was so absorbed in the letters that I almost didn't notice it, a smaller envelope tucked at the very bottom of the box, separate from the others. It wasn't bundled with ribbon. It wasn't addressed. It simply said, in my grandmother's handwriting, "Too painful to mail." My hands shook as I picked it up. This envelope was thicker than the others, heavier. I opened it carefully and found not one letter, but several, all written by my grandmother and all unsent. The first one was dated December 15, 1944, and it began, "My darling Jimmy, I don't know if you're alive or dead, and not knowing is killing me." I couldn't breathe. This was something different, something darker. These letters held a secret, a part of the story that had been deliberately hidden away. I looked at the box full of letters spread around me, at the evidence of a love story I had never fully understood, and I knew that what I had found was more than just old correspondence. This was a piece of history, a window into my grandparents' souls, and a mystery that demanded to be solved. What happened in December 1944? Why had these letters never been sent? What had my grandmother been too afraid to say? I needed to know. I needed to understand the full story of the love that had created my family. And so I began to read from the beginning, determined to piece together every moment, every fear, every triumph. The afternoon faded into evening, and still I read, following Dorothy and Jimmy through their journey, letter by letter, word by word, heartbeat by heartbeat. This is their story, and it changed mine. I carried the box of letters downstairs to my grandmother's kitchen, the room where we'd shared countless cups of tea and conversations over the years. It felt right to read them there, surrounded by her presence. I made myself coffee, settled into her favorite chair by the window, and organized the letters chronologically. The earliest ones were from the summer of 1943, and I started there at the very beginning of Dorothy and Jimmy's story. The first letter from my grandmother to my grandfather was dated July 28, 1943, just 2 weeks before his first letter to her. Her handwriting was neat and careful, almost formal, the writing of a young woman who wanted to make a good impression. "Dear James," it began, not Jimmy, but James. "Thank you for the lovely evening at the USO dance last Saturday. I hope your journey back to camp was pleasant. My sister Maggie hasn't stopped teasing me about how much I smiled that night. I told her it was just a nice dance, but between you and me, it was more than that." I smiled, imagining my grandmother as a 22-year-old woman, trying to sound casual while her heart was probably racing as she wrote those words. The letter went on to describe her work at the textile factory, where she and other women had taken over jobs left vacant by men who'd gone to war. She wrote about her family, about rationing, about the victory garden her mother kept in the backyard. And then, at the end, a glimpse of vulnerability. "I know you're leaving for training soon, and I know what that means. I won't pretend I'm not frightened. But I want you to know that I'll write to you, if you'd like me to. It would be nice to have someone to share my thoughts with, someone who might understand what these strange times feel like." His response came quickly. The next letter was his, dated August 10th, and it was clear that her words had meant everything to him. "My dearest Dorothy, and I hope you'll let me call you that, because Miss Hayes feels much too formal for what I'm feeling. I would very much like you to write to me. In fact, I can't think of anything I'd like more. You asked if I understand what these strange times feel like, and the truth is everything feels strange except when I think of you. You're the one clear thing in all this uncertainty." Over the next several weeks, their letters became more frequent and more intimate. The formality fell away like leaves in autumn, revealing the tender shoots of real affection underneath. They wrote about everything, their childhoods, their dreams, their fears about the future. Dorothy told him about the books she loved to read, about how she wanted to be a teacher someday, about her younger brother who was also in the service. Jimmy wrote about growing up on a farm in Kentucky, about his love of baseball, about how he'd promised his mother he'd come home safe. But it was the small details that moved me most. The way he described the exact shade of blue her eyes had been under the lights at the USO dance. The way she admitted that she'd worn his favorite color, green, in the hope that he'd notice. The way they shared jokes that only they would understand, building a private world through ink and paper. By September 1943, the word love had entered their vocabulary. "I love you. Jimmy wrote on September 23rd. "I know it's fast, and I know we've only spent a handful of hours together in person, but I've never been more certain of anything in my life. You are my person. You are my reason. And when this war is over, I'm going to marry you, if you'll have me. Dorothy's response, dated October 1st, was stained with what I could only assume were tears. The ink had smudged in several places, creating small pools of blue, black on the yellowed paper. Yes, she had written, the word underlined 3 times. Yes, Jimmy Mitchell, I will marry you. I love you more than I knew it was possible to love someone. I lie awake at night thinking about the life we'll have together. The house, the children, the ordinary, beautiful days of being yours and you being mine. Come home to me. Please come home to me. I had to set the letter down and wipe my eyes. This was my grandmother, Grandma Dorothy, who had always seemed so practical and composed, writing with abandon about a love that consumed her. And this was my grandfather, who I'd only known as an elderly man of few words, pouring his heart onto paper with a passion that took my breath away. The letters from late 1943 and early 1944 chronicled their deepening bond despite the distance. Jimmy had been shipped overseas to England by November, preparing for something big that he couldn't name in his letters because of military censorship. Dorothy continued working at the factory, saving money for their future, and writing to him every single day without fail. But the war was always there, a dark shadow over their happiness. Dorothy wrote about the gold star flags appearing in neighbors' windows, marking homes where sons and husbands would never return. She wrote about the fear that gripped her every time she saw a Western Union messenger on their street, terrified that he might be coming to her door. I'm trying to be brave, she wrote in January 1944. Everyone says we have to keep our spirits up, that it's our duty on the home front. But Jimmy, I'm so scared sometimes I can barely breathe. Every day that passes without a letter from you feels like a year. And then when your letters do arrive, I read them so many times the paper starts to fall apart in my hands. I keep them all in a box under my bed. They're my most precious possessions. Jimmy's letters from this period showed the strain of what he was experiencing, though he tried to shield her from the worst of it. He couldn't tell her where he was or what he was doing, but I could read between the lines. The tone changed. The fear became more real. He wrote less about the future and more about the present moment, as if he wasn't sure how many moments he had left. I want you to know something, he wrote in March 1944. Something happens to me, and don't cry when you read this, darling, just listen. If something happens, I need you to know that loving you has been the greatest honor of my life. You've made me better. You've made me braver. You've given me a reason to fight harder than I've ever fought for anything. Whatever happens, you made my life worth living. Dorothy's response was fierce. Don't you dare write to me like you're saying goodbye, James Mitchell. Don't you dare. You're coming home. You promised me, and I'm holding you to that promise. I won't accept anything less than 50 years of marriage, do you hear me? 50 years minimum. So you keep your head down, you stay safe, and you come back to me. They would end up with 68 years together, I thought, tears streaming down my face. She got her 50 years and then some. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the letters revealed that something big was happening. Jimmy's letters became shorter and less frequent. Dorothy's anxiety leaped off the page. She tried to stay positive, filling her letters with news from home, plans for their wedding, descriptions of the dress she was saving up for, but underneath it all was a current of fear that grew stronger with each passing week. And then came June, D-Day, the invasion of Normandy that would turn the tide of the war. Jimmy's letters stopped completely. Dorothy's letters from June and July 1944 were heartbreaking. At first, she remained optimistic, telling herself that he was simply too busy to write, that the mail was delayed, that everything would be fine. But as days turned into weeks, her words became more desperate. It's been 3 weeks since your last letter. She wrote on July 15th. Everyone tells me not to worry, that no news is good news, but I can't help it. I see your face every time I close my eyes. I hear your voice in my dreams. Please be alive. Please be safe. Please find a way to let me know you're okay. Finally, in early August, a letter arrived. It was short, written in a shaky hand that didn't quite look like Jimmy's usual writing. My darling, I'm alive. I can't tell you much, but I'm alive. I was hurt, but I'm healing. I'm sorry I couldn't write sooner. I'm sorry I scared you. I love you. I'll write more when I can. Wait for me. Keep waiting for me. Your Jimmy. Dorothy's relief poured through her next letter like water through a broken dam. You're alive. You're alive. I must have read your letter 100 times already. I don't care that you were hurt. I care desperately, but you're alive and that's all that matters. Get better, my love. Take all the time you need to heal. I'll be here. I'll always be here. The letters resumed, though less frequently than before. Jimmy was recovering in a field hospital, then sent back to his unit. The war ground on through the fall of 1944. And then, as I reached for the letters from December, I remembered the separate envelope. The one marked, too painful to mail. I set aside the regular correspondence and picked up those unsent letters again, my hands trembling. It was time to learn the secret my grandmother had kept hidden even from the man she loved. The first unsent letter was dated December 15, 1944, and as I began to read, I understood why the truth had been too painful to share. The unsent letter from December 15, 1944, began with words that made my blood run cold. My darling Jimmy, I don't know if you're alive or dead, and not knowing is killing me. It's been 6 weeks since your last letter. 6 weeks of waking up every morning with hope and going to bed every night with despair. The War Department hasn't contacted me. I'm not your wife yet, so I suppose they wouldn't. But I've heard nothing from your family either, and that silence is its own kind of answer. I had to pause, my heart pounding. 6 weeks without contact. In wartime, that could mean anything, and usually it meant the worst. Dorothy's handwriting became less steady as the letter continued. I need to tell you something, and I'm writing it down even though I may never send this letter, even though you may never read these words. But I need to say it, to put it into the universe, to make it me. I'm carrying your child. The words hit me like a physical blow. I read them again, then again, trying to process what this meant. My grandmother had been pregnant in 1944, before they were married. I know what you're thinking, the letter continued. I know what everyone would think. But I don't regret that night, Jimmy. Not for 1 second. It was June, right before you shipped out for the invasion. You came home on a 3-day pass, remember? We had been so careful for so long, so proper, waiting for the wedding we had planned. But that night, we both knew it might be the last time we ever saw each other. And I wanted to be yours completely. I wanted to give you all of me before you left. I could barely breathe. This was a side of my grandmother I had never imagined. Young, passionate, willing to break the rules for love. I found out for certain last week, she wrote. I'm almost 3 months along now. I haven't told anyone, not my mother, not my sister Maggie, no one. I'm terrified, Jimmy. Terrified of what people will say, terrified of raising a child alone. Terrified that you'll never know you're going to be a father. But more than anything, I'm terrified that you're gone, and I'll have to face this world without you. The letter went on, pages of raw fear and desperate hope. She wrote about her plans. How she could hide the pregnancy for maybe another month or two. How she might go stay with a cousin upstate and pretend to be a war widow. How she would protect their child no matter what it cost her. But I'm waiting, she concluded. I'm still waiting for you. I'm waiting for a letter, for a telegram, for any sign that you're coming back to me. I'm waiting because giving up on you would mean giving up on everything I believe about love and faith, and the way the universe works. So I'll wait a little longer. I'll wait until I can't wait anymore. And then I'll do what I have to do to protect what we created together. The letter was never sent. Instead, she had written another one dated December 22, 1944. Still no word. This one began. It's been 7 weeks now. I went to the recruitment office today and tried to get information, but they wouldn't tell me anything since I'm not family. Your mother wrote to me yesterday. She hasn't heard from you either. She's trying to stay positive, but I could read the fear between the lines of her letter. This letter was shorter, more resigned. Dorothy wrote about Christmas approaching, about how empty the holiday would feel, about how she'd made a decision. She would wait until New Year's Day. If she hadn't heard from Jimmy by then, she would tell her family about the baby and make arrangements to leave town. She couldn't marry him if he was gone, but she could love their child. She could raise a piece of him, keep him alive in that way. I'm not giving up, she wrote. I want you to know that. Even if you never read this, I want the universe to know that I'm not giving up on you. I'm just accepting reality. I'm just doing what I have to do to survive. The third unsent letter was dated December 30, 1944. This one was different. The handwriting was shaky, almost illegible in places, as if written in great emotional distress. Tomorrow is New Year's Eve, it read. Tomorrow is the day I promised myself I would stop waiting. I've packed a bag. I've written a letter to my mother explaining everything. I've arranged to stay with cousin Beth in Ohio until after the baby is born. I'll leave on January 2nd, start a new life, become a different person. Dorothy Hayes will disappear, and in her place will be Mrs. Dorothy, someone. I'll invent a dead husband, wear a ring I'll buy at the pawn shop, create a whole fiction to protect our child from shame. But then the tone changed abruptly. I went to church today. I don't know why. I've been angry at God lately, angry at the whole world. But I went, and I sat in the back pew, and I prayed. Not for you to come back, because I've done that prayer a million times and it doesn't seem to work. Instead, I prayed for strength. I prayed for the courage to let you go. I prayed for the ability to forgive God for taking you from me. The next paragraph was smudged, as if tears had fallen on the paper as she wrote. And then, Jimmy, the strangest thing happened. I felt this peace. Just for a moment. This certainty that everything would be okay one way or another. I don't know what it means. I don't know if it's real or if I'm just so desperate for hope that I'm creating it in my mind. But I'm going to hold on to that feeling. I'm going to carry it with me into whatever comes next. That was the last of the unsent letters. 3 letters, documenting the darkest period of my grandmother's life, when she thought she had lost everything. I set them aside carefully and reached for the regular correspondence again, looking for what came next. The next letter in the bundle was dated January 3, 1945, and it was from Jimmy. My darling, darling Dot. It began, and even across 8 decades I could feel the urgency in those words. I'm alive. I'm so sorry I'm alive and I love you and I'm coming home. I don't know what you've been going through, but I can imagine, and I'm so desperately sorry. I was missing in action. I was behind enemy lines for almost 2 months. I couldn't write, couldn't send word, couldn't let anyone know I was alive. It's been hell, but I survived because of you. Because I knew you were waiting. Because I knew I had to get back to you. He wrote about his experience, as much as the censors would allow, about being separated from his unit during a German counteroffensive, about hiding in a bombed-out farmhouse with 2 other soldiers, about the harrowing journey back to Allied lines. He wrote about the fear, the cold, the hunger, but mostly about the promise he made to himself every single day that he would survive, that he would make it home, that he would marry Dorothy Hayes and spend the rest of his life making up for the worry he'd caused her. I'm being sent home, he concluded. I'll be stateside by the end of January. I'm coming home to you. Start planning our wedding because the moment I step off that ship, I'm making you my wife. I love you more than words can express. Your Jimmy. Dorothy's response, dated January 8, 1945, was an explosion of joy and relief. You're alive! You're alive! You're coming home, Jimmy! I can barely see the page through my tears. I've read your letter so many times the paper is starting to fall apart. You're alive and you're coming home and we're going to be married and everything is going to be wonderful. But then, in the middle of her celebration, a shift in tone. I need to tell you something, my love. Something important. Something that can't wait until you're home. And here, inexplicably, there was a line crossed out. Heavily crossed out, so thoroughly that I couldn't read what she had written underneath. The letter continued, actually no. Some things should be said in person, not in a letter. Some things are too important for ink and paper. I'll tell you when you're home. I'll tell you everything. But know this, nothing has changed about how much I love you. Nothing could ever change that. I stared at that crossed out line, my mind racing. She had started to tell him about the pregnancy, then stopped herself. Why? Was she afraid of how he'd react? Was she worried the letter might go astray? Or had she simply realized, in that moment of joy, that this was news to share face to face? The next few letters were filled with wedding plans. Dorothy wrote about finding a dress, about talking to the minister at her church, about how her mother was already baking enough food to feed an army, or at least a groom and his family. Jimmy's letters grew shorter as his arrival drew closer. He was in processing, waiting for transport, counting down the days. And then, dated February 14, 1945, Valentine's Day, there was a telegram pasted into a page of Dorothy's journal. I hadn't noticed the journal before. It had been tucked between the letters, a small leather-bound book with her initials embossed on the cover. The telegram read, Habry 18 stu mararwam ur 19 stiop almi ovistop gemy. Dorothy had written in the journal below the telegram, he's coming home. In 4 days, he'll be here. In 5 days I'll be his wife. And then I'll tell him about the baby. I'll tell him that he's going to be a father, that our family is already beginning, that the love we made in those desperate hours before he left is growing inside me. I'm terrified and thrilled and so grateful. We're going to be okay. Against all odds, we're going to be okay. I sat back in my grandmother's chair, overwhelmed by what I had just learned. My grandmother had been pregnant when my grandfather came home from the war. They had gotten married quickly. I'd always known that, had always heard the family story about their hasty Valentine's Day wedding. But I'd never known why. And then it hit me. I did the math quickly in my head. If she was 3 months pregnant in December 1944, that meant the baby would have been born in June 1945. My mother was born in June 1945. My mother, practical, no-nonsense Margaret Mitchell, who I'd always been told was born bit early after her parents' wedding, had actually been conceived before they were married. My mother was that baby. The one my grandmother had been so terrified to protect. The one my grandfather never knew about until he came home from the war. I looked at the pile of letters still waiting to be read, knowing that somewhere in those pages was the story of how Jimmy reacted, how they built their life together, how they turned those desperate circumstances into a marriage that lasted nearly 7 decades. My grandmother had been so much braver than I ever knew. She had faced the possibility of single motherhood in 1944, when that would have meant complete social ruin. She had been willing to give up everything, her home, her family, her good name, to protect her unborn child. and she had loved my grandfather with a fierceness that sustained her through the darkest uncertainty imaginable. I picked up the next letter, my hands trembling, ready to learn how this story of desperation and fear transformed into the love story that built my family. The letters from mid-February 1945 were different. They weren't letters at all. They were Dorothy's journal entries, written in real time as the most important days of her life unfolded. February 18, 1945, the first entry began. He's home. Jimmy is home. I saw him step off the bus this afternoon, and for a moment I couldn't move. I had imagined this moment 1,000 times, running to him, throwing my arms around him, kissing him in front of everyone. But when it actually happened, I just stood there, frozen, tears streaming down my face. She described how he looked, thinner than she remembered, harder somehow, with shadows in his eyes that hadn't been there before. But when he saw her, those shadows lifted, and he smiled the smile she had fallen in love with 2 years earlier. He dropped his duffel bag right there on the sidewalk and ran to me, she wrote. And when he held me, I felt like I could finally breathe again for the first time in months. He whispered in my ear, I'm home. I'm really home. And I'm never leaving you again. The entry continued with details of that evening. Dinner with both families, Jimmy's mother crying tears of joy, Dorothy's father shaking Jimmy's hand over and over, unable to find words. And through it all, Dorothy kept her secret, waiting for the right moment. I'm 4 months along now, she wrote. I'm showing, but not so much that anyone would notice under my loose dresses. Tomorrow we'll be married, and tomorrow night I'll tell him. I'm praying he'll be happy. I'm praying this won't change how he feels about me. The next entry was dated February 19, 1945, their wedding day. Mrs. James Mitchell, she had written at the top of the page, the letters large and decorated with small hearts. That's who I am now. We were married this morning at 10 o'clock in my family's church. It was a small ceremony, just family and a few close friends. I wore my mother's dress, altered to fit me, and Jimmy wore his uniform. When he saw me walking down the aisle, he started crying, and that made me cry, and I think half the church was in tears by the time I reached him. She described the ceremony, the vows they spoke, the moment the minister pronounced them husband and wife. When Jimmy kissed me, it felt like everything, all the fear, all the waiting, all the darkness, just melted away. We made it. We actually made it. But then the entry took a darker turn. Tonight is our wedding night. We're staying at the Parker Hotel downtown. It's not fancy, but it's ours for the next 2 days before Jimmy has to report to the demobilization center. I need to tell him about the baby. I've been rehearsing what to say all day, but now I'm terrified. What if he's angry? What if he feels trapped? What if? The entry stopped there, mid-sentence. The next page was dated February 20, 1945, and the handwriting was shaky emotional. I told him. Those 3 words sat alone on the page, and I held my breath as I read what came next. Last night, after we'd been in our hotel room for an hour, I couldn't wait any longer. I was shaking so badly I could barely speak, but I took his hands and I said, Jimmy, I need to tell you something. Something important. He looked worried immediately. I think he thought I was about to tell him I didn't love him anymore, or that I'd met someone else while he was gone. But I said, I'm pregnant. We're going to have a baby in June. I could picture the scene so clearly. My grandmother, barely 23 years old, terrified and brave, telling her new husband that they were already a family. He didn't say anything at first, Dorothy wrote. He just stared at me, and I couldn't read his expression. The silence stretched on, and I felt my heart breaking, and then he said very quietly, since June, since before I left. And I nodded, unable to speak. The next line was underlined twice, and then he started laughing. Not mean laughter, she clarified, not mocking or angry. He was laughing with pure joy. He picked me up and spun me around the room and said, We're having a baby! We're having a baby! He was so happy, so completely, unreservedly happy, that I started laughing too, and crying, and we both ended up sitting on the floor of that hotel room, holding each other and laughing and crying at the same time. She described what he told her then, that he had thought about that night in June every single day he was overseas, that when he was behind enemy lines, starving and freezing and convinced he was going to die, the memory of that night, of loving her completely, was what kept him going. That he had no regrets, only gratitude that they had been brave enough to take that chance. I thought I might die without ever really being yours, he told me. I thought I might never get to hold you like that again. I'm glad we didn't wait. I'm glad we have this. And then he put his hand on my stomach, even though there's barely anything to feel yet, and he said, Hello in there, this is your father. I can't wait to meet you. I had to set the journal down and compose myself. This was my grandfather, Grandpa Jim, who had always been so quiet and reserved. Overcome with joy at learning he was going to be a father, this was the moment that began my family. The entries over the next few months chronicled their adjustment to married life. Jimmy was discharged from the army in March, and found work at the manufacturing plant where Dorothy's father was a foreman. They moved into a small apartment. Just 3 rooms, but it's ours, Dorothy wrote, and began preparing for the baby. But the journal also revealed struggles I hadn't expected. Jimmy came home from the war changed. He had nightmares that woke him screaming. Loud noises made him flinch. Sometimes he would go quiet for hours, staring at nothing, lost in memories he wouldn't share. Last night he had the worst nightmare yet. Dorothy wrote in April. He was shouting in his sleep, thrashing around. When I woke him up, he didn't recognize me at first. He looked at me like I was a stranger, or worse, like I was someone he was afraid of. It took several minutes before he came back to himself. He held me and apologized over and over, but I'm worried about him. The war may be over for everyone else, but I don't think it's over for Jimmy yet. There were also entries about the pregnancy. Morning sickness that lasted all day. Exhaustion that made it hard to work. The social judgment she faced when people realized she was already 5 months pregnant despite having only been married a few weeks. Mrs. Henderson at the market made a comment today. Dorothy wrote in March. She looked at my stomach, then at my ring finger, then back at my stomach, and said, that baby certainly is in a hurry to arrive. I wanted to tell her the truth. That Jimmy and I loved each other with everything we had before he went to war. That we created this baby out of love and desperation, and the very real possibility that he would never come home. But instead I just smiled and said yes, we're very excited. Another entry from April. Maggie asked me today if I regret not waiting. I told her the truth, that I regret nothing. Not the fear, not the uncertainty, not even the judgment we're facing now. Because this baby, this child that's moving inside me right now, is proof that love can survive anything. Jimmy could have died a dozen times over there. I could have lost him and never known this joy of carrying his child. But we're here. We made it. And soon we'll be 3. The entries from May showed increasing anticipation. Jimmy was building a crib, though he wasn't much of a carpenter and had to start over twice. Dorothy was sewing baby clothes from fabric scraps, preparing a small nursery in the corner of their bedroom. Both sets of grandparents, to be, had gotten over their initial shock and were now excited about the coming arrival. Jimmy talks to the baby every night, Dorothy wrote. He puts his head on my stomach and tells stories about his childhood, about the war, about all the things we're going to do as a family. He's going to be such a good father. Sometimes I watch him and I can't believe how lucky I am. I could have lost him. I was so close to losing him. But he's here and he's mine and we're building this life together. And then June 12, 1945, she's here. Our daughter is here. Margaret Rose Mitchell, named after Jimmy's mother and mine. 8 pounds 4 ounces, with a full head of dark hair in her father's eyes. She's perfect. Absolutely perfect. The entry went on to describe the birth, 36 hours of labor. Jimmy pacing in the waiting room, the moment they placed the baby in Dorothy's arms and she looked up to see her husband's face, transformed by love and wonder. When they finally let Jimmy in to see us, he just stood in the doorway and stared. Dorothy wrote, and then he came over to the bed and looked at our daughter, really looked at her and said, she's real. You're both real. I'm holding my daughter. He was crying, and I was crying, and the baby was crying, and it was the most beautiful moment of my entire life. My mother. They were talking about my mother. I looked at the date again, June 12, 1945. I had always known my mother's birthday, of course, but I'd never known the full story of her arrival. I'd never known how desperately wanted she was, how she represented hope and survival and the victory of love over everything the war had tried to destroy. I turned the page expecting more journal entries, but instead I found a letter. It was from Jimmy to Dorothy, dated June 14, 1945, written from the hospital waiting room while Dorothy and the baby were sleeping. My dearest wife, it began. I'm sitting here watching you sleep, watching our daughter sleep in her bassinet beside you. And I needed to write this down before the feeling fades, though I don't think it ever will. The letter was only 1 page, but every word was precious. He wrote about the moment he heard the baby cry for the first time, about how his knees had gone weak with relief and joy. He wrote about holding Margaret for the first time, how terrified he'd been that he would drop her or hold her wrong, and how she had wrapped her tiny hand around his finger, and he'd felt his entire world shift to accommodate this new love. I didn't think I could love anyone as much as I love you. He wrote, but now I understand, love doesn't divide, it multiplies. I love you more because of her, I love her more because of you. You've given me everything, a home, a family, a reason to believe that all the darkness I experienced over there had purpose. I was meant to survive so I could be here for this, for you, for her, for us. He ended with a promise. I'm going to spend the rest of my life making sure you never regret choosing me. I'm going to be the husband and father you both deserve. I'm going to love you both so well that all the hard times, all the fear, all the waiting, it will all be worth it. This is my vow to you, written in this quiet hospital room while the sun comes up on the first day of our life as a family. I pressed the letter to my chest, overwhelmed. This was the foundation everything else was built on. This was where my family began, not with a simple love story, but with something deeper and more complicated. With fear and faith, with separation and reunion, with a pregnancy that could have ended in shame but instead became their greatest joy. There were still more letters to read, more years to discover. But I already understood something fundamental about my grandparents that I'd never known before. Their love wasn't easy or simple. It was tested in ways I couldn't imagine. And it survived because they chose each other again and again, through everything. I had been reading for hours, lost in my grandparents' story, when I noticed something odd. The letters and journal entries from the late 1940s and early 1950s were all there, documenting the ordinary, beautiful chaos of building a life together. Jimmy's struggles to adjust to civilian life, Dorothy's exhaustion as a new mother, the joy of watching Margaret grow, the purchase of their first house in 1948, the birth of my Uncle Robert in 1950. But tucked at the very bottom of the box, beneath everything else, was another envelope. This one was different from the others, larger, made of heavier paper, and sealed with wax that had cracked with age. On the front, in my grandmother's handwriting, were the words, "The whole truth. For whoever finds these letters." My hands trembled as I carefully broke the seal and pulled out several pages of stationery. The letter was dated March 15, 1995, 50 years after the war ended. My grandmother would have been 73 years old when she wrote this. To whoever is reading this. It began, I imagine it's one of my grandchildren. Sarah, perhaps, or maybe one of the younger ones. By the time you find this, I'll likely be gone, and these letters will be all that remains of the girl I used to be, and the love that shaped my entire life. I caught my breath. She had written this specifically for us to find. This was intentional. You've read the letters by now. You know about Jimmy and me, about the war, about Margaret being conceived before we were married. But there's more to the story. Parts I never told anyone, not even your grandfather in some cases. Parts I kept locked away because they were too painful, too complicated, or simply too private. But you deserve to know the whole truth. What followed was a confession that changed everything I thought I understood. When Jimmy went missing in action in December 1944, I wasn't just worried about being pregnant and alone. I was also being courted by another man. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. Another man. His name was Robert Callahan, she continued. He was Jimmy's best friend from basic training, and he had been discharged early due to a leg injury he sustained in North Africa. He came to visit me in November 1944, saying he had promised Jimmy that if anything happened to him, he would make sure I was taken care of. Dorothy described how Robert had started coming by regularly, bringing groceries, helping with repairs around her family's house, offering companionship during the darkest days of Jimmy's disappearance. At first it was innocent, friendly, exactly what a best friend would do. But as the weeks passed and there was still no word about Jimmy, Robert's intentions became clear. He proposed to me on Christmas Eve 1944, Dorothy wrote. He said he'd loved me since the moment Jimmy had shown him my photograph back in basic training. He said Jimmy would want me to be taken care of, that I shouldn't be alone, that he could give me and the baby a good life. He said he didn't expect me to love him the way I loved Jimmy, but that he would love me enough for both of us. I sat back, stunned. My grandmother had received a marriage proposal while carrying my grandfather's child, while my grandfather was missing and presumed dead. I almost said yes, she confessed. God forgive me, I almost said yes. I was terrified and desperate, and Robert was kind and present and real. Jimmy was a memory, a ghost, a collection of letters from someone who might not exist anymore. The practical thing would have been to accept Robert's proposal, to give my baby a father, to give myself security and protection from judgment. But she hadn't said yes. I already knew that. So what stopped her? I went home that Christmas Eve and I read every single letter Jimmy had ever written to me, she continued. It took me all night. And as I read, I realized something. Jimmy was still alive to me. His words were alive. His love was alive. And I couldn't betray that love, not for safety, not for security, not for anything. Even if he never came home, even if he was already dead, I was his. I would always be his. She wrote that she told Robert no the next morning. He was heartbroken but understood. He left town shortly after, unwilling to watch her wait for a man who might never return. And then 2 weeks later, Jimmy's letter arrived. He was alive. He was coming home. And I had been so close to giving up on him, so close to choosing an easier path. I never told him about Robert's proposal. I never told anyone. It was my secret, my shame, my moment of weakness that I couldn't forgive myself for. But there was more. The letter continued with another revelation. The other thing I never told anyone, not even Jimmy, especially not Jimmy, was how close I came to not going through with the pregnancy. My heart stopped. I had to reread that line to make sure I understood correctly. In early December 1944, before I knew Jimmy was still alive, I went to see a woman. Dorothy wrote, her handwriting becoming shakier, as if this confession was even harder than the first. Her name was Mrs. Pierce, and she was known in certain circles as someone who could help girls in trouble. I didn't have an appointment. I just showed up at her door one evening, desperate and scared and convinced I couldn't do this alone. She described sitting in Mrs. Pierce's living room, listening to the woman explain what she could do, how much it would cost, how risky it would be. Dorothy sat there for 2 hours, trying to make herself agree, trying to convince herself it was the right choice. But I couldn't do it, she wrote. I sat there, knowing it would solve so many problems, knowing it would make everything easier, and I couldn't say the words. Because even then, even in the darkest moment of my life, I loved that baby. I loved her so much it hurt. She was part of Jimmy, the only part of him I might ever have. How could I let that go? She wrote that she walked out of Mrs. Pierce's house and never went back. She made her decision she would have the baby, raise the baby, love the baby, no matter what it cost her. Your mother never knew how close she came to not existing, Dorothy wrote. And neither did your grandfather. I couldn't bear to tell him. How do you tell someone you love that you considered not having their child? How do you explain that kind of desperation to someone who wasn't there? The letter went on, revealing smaller secrets and private moments. How she had sometimes resented the baby during the pregnancy, angry at the situation she found herself in. How she had cried herself to sleep most nights in January 1945, convinced she was going to face motherhood alone. How when Jimmy finally came home, she sometimes looked at him and felt angry that he'd left her, even though she knew it wasn't his fault. Marriage isn't always easy, she wrote. Love isn't always enough. There were times, especially in those early years when Jimmy was struggling with what we'd now call PTSD, when money was tight, when I was exhausted from caring for 2 babies, when I wondered if we'd made a mistake, when I wondered if Robert's offer of a calm, stable life might have been better after all. But then she wrote about what kept them together. The small moments of grace. The way Jimmy would wake up with the babies so she could sleep. The surprise gifts when he'd saved up enough for something special. The way he looked at her, even after 10 years, 20 years, 40 years, like she was still the girl at the USO dance. The way they learned to talk about the hard things, slowly, painfully, but honestly. We almost divorced in 1952, she revealed, and I gasped out loud. Things had gotten so bad. Jimmy was drinking too much, I was overwhelmed with 2 children and a part-time job. We barely spoke to each other except to argue. We saw a lawyer. We made plans to separate. But they didn't. One night, sitting at their kitchen table with the divorce papers between them, Jimmy had started to cry. And then Dorothy started to cry. And they talked, really talked, for the first time in months. He told me about the things he'd seen in the war, Dorothy wrote. Things he'd never told anyone. And I told him how lonely I felt, how scared I'd been during those months he was missing, how I sometimes still felt like I was waiting for him to disappear again. We cried together. We held each other. And we tore up those divorce papers. She wrote that they went to counseling, unusual for the 1950s, but their minister recommended it. They learned to communicate better. Jimmy found healthier ways to cope with his trauma. Dorothy learned to ask for help instead of trying to do everything alone. Slowly, painfully, they rebuilt their marriage into something stronger than before. By our 10th anniversary, she wrote, I could honestly say I was happier than I'd ever been. And by our 20th, I couldn't imagine my life with anyone else. The man I almost married out of desperation became the love of my life through choice. Through work, through refusing to give up on each other even when it would have been easier to walk away. The letter concluded with a reflection on their entire life together. We had 68 years, your grandfather and I. 68 years of joy and sorrow, triumph and failure, love and frustration and everything in between. We raised 4 children. We buried one, your Aunt Elizabeth, who died at 3 days old in 1953, a grief that nearly destroyed us. We welcomed 14 grandchildren and, before I die, hopefully some great-grandchildren. We built a life. Was it the fairy tale those early letters might suggest? No. Real life never is. But it was real and it was ours, and I wouldn't trade a single moment of it. Not the fear, not the pain, not even the moments I wanted to give up. Because all of it, every struggle, every joy, every ordinary day, brought me to a place where I can look back on my life and say with complete honesty I was loved, and I loved well. She ended with a message directly to whoever found the letters. If you're reading this, I want you to understand something important. Love isn't what you see in the movies. It's not always grand gestures and perfect moments. Real love is choosing each other when it's hard. It's forgiving each other for being human. It's building something together that's stronger than either of you could be alone. Jimmy wasn't perfect. I wasn't perfect. Our marriage wasn't perfect. but it was real, and it was worth fighting for. Remember that, whoever you are. Remember that the best things in life are worth fighting for, especially when, the fight is hardest. All my love, Dorothy Mitchell. I set the letter down with shaking hands. My grandmother, wise, dignified, strong Grandma Dorothy, had been so much more complicated than I ever knew. She had faced impossible choices. She had moments of weakness and doubt. She had considered paths not taken. She had struggled, faltered, and persevered. And she had loved. God, how she had loved. I looked at the box of letters spread around me. Evidence of a love that survived war, separation, doubt, poverty, trauma, grief, and all the ordinary challenges of building a life together. It wasn't a simple story. It wasn't easy. But it was beautiful precisely because it was real. There were still a few more letters to read, correspondence from later years, anniversary cards, notes they'd written to each other throughout their marriage. But I already had what I'd been searching for. I understood now. I understood the foundation my family was built on, and it was so much stronger and more complex than I'd ever imagined. The remaining letters in the box spanned decades, a chronicle of a marriage that endured through all the seasons of life. I picked them up carefully, these later pieces of my grandparents' story, and continued reading. There was a letter from Jimmy to Dorothy, dated February 14, 1955, their 10th anniversary. My dearest Dot, it began in his familiar handwriting, now more confident and steady than the shaky scrawl of his war letters. 10 years, a decade, 3,650 days of being married to you, and somehow it still doesn't feel like enough time. It never will be. He wrote about the life they'd built together, the house they'd bought, the children they were raising, the routines they'd established. But more than that, he wrote about gratitude. I think about December 1944 sometimes, he admitted. About those 2 months when I was behind enemy lines, convinced I was going to die. I think about how I made bargains with God in my head. Let me live, and I'll be a better man. Let me see Dorothy again, and I'll never take a single day with her for granted. And Dot, I've tried to keep that promise. Every morning when I wake up next to you, I remember that I almost didn't get this. This ordinary, beautiful life of ours, it's not guaranteed. It's a gift. The letter went on to acknowledge the hard times they'd weathered. I know I haven't always been easy to live with. I know the war changed me in ways that hurt you. I know there were times you wondered if you'd made a mistake choosing me. But thank you for staying. Thank you for fighting for us when I didn't know how to fight for myself. Thank you for seeing the man I could be, even when I couldn't see it. He ended with a promise. Here's to the next 10 years, and the 10 after that, and however many more we're blessed with. I love you more today than I did 10 years ago, and I'll love you more tomorrow than I do today. You are my home, Dorothy Mitchell. You always have been. There was another letter from 1963, their 18th anniversary. This one was from Dorothy to Jimmy, written in a style more reflective and mature. My darling husband, it began. 18 years ago today, I married my best friend. I didn't know that then. I thought you were my great love, my passion, the answer to all my loneliness. And you were those things. But I didn't know you'd also become my partner, my confidant, the person I can't imagine making any decision without consulting first. She wrote about how marriage had changed her, shaped her, made her into someone she barely recognized, from that frightened 23-year-old who'd hidden a pregnancy and waited desperately for a missing soldier. You've made me braver, she wrote. You've made me stronger. Not because you were strong for me, but because you showed me your weakness and trusted me to love you anyway. The letter referenced their children. Margaret was 18 now, preparing to leave for college. Robert was 13, all gangly limbs and teenage attitude. Elizabeth's absence still hung over everything like a shadow they'd learned to live with. And there were 2 more I hadn't known about. David, age 9, and Susan, age 6. We've built this incredible thing, Dorothy wrote. This family, this home, this life, and yes, it's been hard. It's been harder than anything I could have imagined when I was young and naive and thought love was enough. But I was right about one thing: love is enough. Just not the easy kind of love. Not the feelings kind. The choice kind. The everyday I choose you kind. That love is enough for anything. There were anniversary cards from the 1970s and 1980s, each one revealing another layer of their relationship. By their 30th anniversary, Jimmy's handwriting had grown shakier. He'd developed arthritis. But the sentiment remained strong. 30 years of waking up next to you, he wrote simply. Never long enough. Dorothy's 50th anniversary card to Jimmy in 1995, the same year she'd written the long confessional letter, was particularly moving. 50 years, she wrote. Half a century of being yours. We're old now, darling. Our joints ache, our memories sometimes fail us, our children, our grandparents themselves. But when I look at you, I still see the soldier who came home to me. I still feel the flutter in my chest I felt at that first USO dance. Age has taken a lot from us, but it hasn't taken that. But the most powerful letter was one I almost missed. A small piece of paper, torn from a notebook, tucked into a card from 2005. It was in Jimmy's handwriting, though barely legible, the letters large and uncertain. The date was February 14, 2005, their 60th anniversary. It said simply. I don't have many words left, the stroke took them. But I have these: I love you. I have always loved you. I will love you beyond my last breath. Thank you for 60 years. Thank you for everything. I knew from family history that my grandfather had suffered a severe stroke in 2004 that left him partially paralyzed and unable to speak more than a few words at a time. He'd lived for another 8 years, but those years had been difficult. His mind still sharp but his body failing, his ability to communicate reduced to gestures and single words. And yet he'd managed to write this. Shaky and simple, but everything that needed to be said. Dorothy's response was paper, clipped to his note, written in her own increasingly unsteady hand. My dearest Jimmy, it read. For 60 years you've given me your words, in letters, in vows, in everyday conversation, in whispered endearments in the dark. Now your words are limited, but your love is not. I see it in the way you look at me. I feel it in the way you hold my hand. I know it in the way you fought to write these few precious sentences. Words or no words, I know. I've always known. I love you too with everything I am and everything I'll ever be. Happy 60th anniversary, my darling. We made it. Against all the odds through all the years we made it. Always yours. There was one final letter in the box. It was dated March 2013, just a few weeks before my grandfather died. It wasn't addressed to anyone. It was simply labeled, Last Words. It was in my grandmother's handwriting, and it began, Jimmy is dying. The doctors say it could be days, maybe a week. He's in and out of consciousness, mostly sleeping now. But this morning he had a moment of clarity. He opened his eyes, looked right at me, and said 3 words worth every moment. My grandmother continued. I asked him what he meant, though I think I knew. And he squeezed my hand. That's how we've communicated these last few years, in squeezes and touches, and he smiled. That beautiful smile I fell in love with 70 years ago. And I understood, he meant all of it. The war, the waiting, the fear, the struggles, the joys, the ordinary days and the extraordinary ones. All of it was worth it to have this life with me. He's right, she wrote. It was worth every moment. I would do it all again. The terror of December 1944, the poverty of the early years, the grief of losing Elizabeth, the frustration of the hard times, the worry of raising children, the heartbreak of watching him decline. I would do it all again for one more day with him. For one more hour. For one more moment of his hand in mine. The letter ended there unfinished, as if she'd been called away suddenly. But I didn't need to read more, I understood. My grandfather died on March 23, 2013. I'd been at the funeral, of course, had held my grandmother's hand as she said goodbye to her husband of 68 years. But I hadn't known then what I knew now. The full weight of what she was losing. Not just a husband, but the person who had shaped her entire life. The soldier she'd waited for, the man she'd almost divorced, the partner she'd chosen every single day for nearly 7 decades. I found one more item at the very bottom of the box, a photograph I'd never seen before. It was of my grandparents on their wedding day, February 19, 1945. They were standing on the steps of the church, my grandmother in her mother's altered dress, my grandfather in his uniform. They were both so young, barely more than children really, with no idea what the next 68 years would bring. But the way they were looking at each other, it was everything. You could see it in their eyes, in the way Jimmy's hand rested protectively on Dorothy's waist, in the way she leaned into him like he was her anchor in a stormy world. Love. Hope. Promise. The beginning of everything. I turned the photograph over. On the back, in my grandmother's handwriting, was a note dated February 19, 2013, their 68th anniversary, just 1 month before Jimmy died. This is where it began, she'd written. 2 frightened kids who loved each other enough to face an uncertain future together. We didn't know what was coming. The joys, the sorrows, the ordinary miracles of a shared life. We just knew we loved each other, and we were brave enough to believe that would be enough. And it was. It was more than enough. It was everything. I held the photograph and cried. For my grandparents, for the love they'd built, for the secrets they'd kept and the truth they'd shared, for the courage it took to choose each other every single day for 68 years. And I understood now why my grandmother had saved these letters, why she'd written that final confessional note, why she'd left this box for someone to find. This was her legacy. Not just the story of a romance, but the truth of a real marriage. With all its complications, all its struggles, all its imperfections, and all its beauty. I spent 3 days reading and rereading those letters before I could bring myself to leave my grandmother's house. I canceled my plans, called in sick to work, and immersed myself completely in Dorothy and Jimmy's world. Each time I read through them, I discovered something new. A detail I'd missed, a connection I hadn't made, a depth of emotion I hadn't fully grasped the first time. On the fourth day, I finally gathered the letters carefully and took them home with me. But I couldn't keep this discovery to myself. This story, my grandparents' story, was too important, too powerful, too real to remain hidden in a box. I started by calling my mother. "Mom," I said when she answered. "I found something in Grandma's attic. Something you need to see." She came over that evening, and I spread the letters out on my dining room table. I'd organized them chronologically, created a timeline of the major events, and marked the most significant pieces. I watched her face as she picked up the first letter, as her eyes widened with recognition of her mother's handwriting. "I never knew these existed," she whispered. I let her read in silence just as I had. I brought her tea, offered tissues when she needed them, and waited. When she finally reached the letters about her own conception and birth, she broke down completely. "I was that baby," she said, pressing her hand to her chest. "I was the one she was so scared about. The one she almost died. But she didn't," I said gently. "She chose you. She chose life. She chose to be brave." My mother read through the night. When she finally finished, as the sun was rising, she looked at me with tears streaming down her face. "I never knew any of this. I thought I was born early. I thought their quick marriage was just because of the war, because everyone was getting married fast back then. I never knew that you were conceived out of wedlock." I finished gently. "That Grandma almost married someone else. That they almost divorced." She nodded, unable to speak. "Does it change anything?" I asked. She was quiet for a long moment, then shook her head. "No, it makes it more real. It makes them more real. I thought I knew my parents, but I only knew one version of them, the grandparents' version, the settled version. I didn't know the young people who fought so hard to be together. I didn't know how much they sacrificed, how much they struggled, how much they chose each other even when it was hard." Over the next few weeks, I shared the letters with the rest of the family. My Uncle Robert, who'd been named after the man my grandmother almost married, though I doubt anyone knew the significance except her. My Aunt Susan, my cousins. Each of them had their own reaction, their own moment of revelation, their own tears. We gathered one Sunday at my mother's house. All of Dorothy and Jimmy's descendants who could make it. 4 children, 14 grandchildren, and 23 great-grandchildren, ranging from my mother at 70, 9 to my cousin's baby who was just 6 months old. I stood in front of them all, holding the box of letters, and I told them the story. The whole story. The romance and the fear, the separation and the reunion, the pregnancy and the proposal from another man, the near divorce and the choice to stay, the 68 years of choosing each other over and over again. "This is where we all came from," I said, gesturing to everyone in the room. "From a love that refused to give up. From 2 people who could have taken easier paths, but chose each other instead. From a soldier who survived the war and a woman who survived the waiting. From a moment of passion before battle and a lifetime of commitment after it." I held up the photograph of their wedding day. "This is them at the beginning. 23 and 25 years old, married in a hurry, with a baby on the way and no idea what the future held. They were scared, they were uncertain. They had every reason to fail." Then I pulled out a photo from their 60th anniversary. 2 elderly people, bent with age but still holding hands, still looking at each other with love. And this is them at the end. 68 years later. They made it, through everything, through war and peace, poverty and prosperity, loss and joy, sickness and health. They made it. My mother stood up, wiping her eyes. "I want to say something." Her voice shook but grew stronger as she continued. "I spent my whole life thinking my parents had a perfect marriage. That they were these people who just naturally fit together, who never struggled, who made it look easy. And I always felt like a failure because my own marriage was hard. Because I fought with your father, because we almost divorced twice, because love wasn't as simple as it seemed to be for my parents." She picked up one of the letters. The one where Dorothy had written about nearly divorcing in 1952. "But now I know the truth. They struggled too. They fought. They almost gave up. And they chose to stay, to fight for their marriage, to build something real instead of something easy. That doesn't make their love less. It makes it more. It makes it real." Uncle Robert spoke next. "Dad never talked about the war much. He'd have nightmares sometimes when I was growing up, and Mom would hold him and talk to him quietly until he calmed down. I never understood what he'd been through. But these letters," he held up one of Jimmy's letters from overseas, "these show me a different man. A scared young soldier who somehow found the courage to survive. Who came home broken and had to learn how to live again. I wish I'd known this story while he was alive. I wish I'd asked him about it. Maybe that's why Grandma left these for us to find," my cousin Jennifer suggested. "So we'd know the whole truth after they were both gone. So we'd understand." We spent hours that afternoon passing the letters around, reading favorite passages aloud, sharing memories of Dorothy and Jimmy that took on new meaning in light of this discovery. My grandmother's strength, My grandfather's quiet devotion. The way they'd held hands even in their 90s like teenagers in love. The way they'd looked at each other across a crowded room at family gatherings, a whole conversation happening in a glance. What do we do with them now? Someone asked, gesturing to the letters. Do we keep them private? Put them away? I had been thinking about this question since the day I found the letters. I think, I said slowly, that Grandma wrote that final letter. The one explaining everything, because she wanted the story told. Not hidden away. She wanted us to know that real love isn't perfect. That real marriage takes work. That real life is complicated and messy and beautiful all at once. So what are you suggesting? My mother asked. I want to digitize them, I said. Scan every letter, preserve them so they won't fade away. I want to create a book, a family history that tells their story from beginning to end. Not just the pretty parts. All of it, the fear and the hope, the mistakes and the triumphs, the humanity of it all. There was silence for a moment, then nods around the room, agreement, understanding. And I continued, that we should each write our own letters. To our spouses, our partners, our children. Tell them the truth about our lives, our loves, our struggles. Create our own legacy of honesty instead of pretending everything is perfect. My mother smiled through her tears. Mom would have liked that. Over the following months, I worked on the project. I carefully scanned each letter, preserving them digitally while storing the originals in archival boxes. I researched the historical context, learning about the battles Jimmy had fought in, the conditions on the home front Dorothy had endured, the social pressures they'd faced as a young couple with a premature baby. I interviewed family members, collecting their memories of Dorothy and Jimmy. And a picture emerged of two people who had lived their values quietly, who had shown love through actions more than words, who had built a legacy not of perfection but of perseverance. My Uncle Robert told me about the time he'd asked his father about the war, when he was about 15. Jimmy had been quiet for a long time, then finally said, "The war taught me that life is precious and short. It taught me not to waste time on things that don't matter. Your mother and you kids, you're what matters. Everything else is just noise." My Aunt Susan remembered a conversation with Dorothy late in her life about marriage. I asked Grandma what the secret was to staying married so long. Susan told me. She laughed and said, "There's no secret, honey. You just decide that you're going to stay and then you stay even when it's hard. Especially when it's hard. And eventually you look back and realize that all those hard days added up to something beautiful." I gathered all these stories, all these memories, and wove them together with the letters into a complete narrative. The book I created wasn't just about romance, it was about resilience. About two people who faced impossible circumstances and found a way through. About love as a verb, an action, a daily choice. On what would have been their 70th anniversary, I gathered the family again. I'd had the book professionally printed and bound. One copy for each of Dorothy and Jimmy's children, and digital copies for everyone else. This is their story, I said as I handed them out. But it's also our story. It's where we came from. It's the foundation everything else is built on. That night, I visited the cemetery where my grandparents were buried side by side. I brought flowers and the book, and I sat on the grass between their headstones. "I found your letters, Grandma," I said aloud, feeling only slightly foolish talking to a grave. "I read them all. I know the whole story now. And I want you to know, I understand why you kept some things secret. I understand why you wanted us to find them eventually, and I understand what you were trying to teach us." I opened the book to the page where I'd transcribed her final confessional letter, the one marked, "The Whole Truth." I read it aloud, my voice carrying on the evening breeze. "Real love is choosing each other when it's hard." I read, "It's forgiving each other for being human. It's building something together that's stronger than either of you could be alone." I closed the book and placed it on the grass between their graves. "You did that," I said. "You built something incredible, and it's not just the family you created, though that would be enough. It's the example you set, the truth you left behind, the lesson that love, real, lasting, meaningful love, isn't about perfection. It's about persistence." As I sat there in the fading light, I thought about my own life, my own relationships, the ways I'd been too quick to give up when things got hard, too focused on finding something easy instead of fighting for something real. I thought about the man I'd been dating for 6 months, the relationship that was just starting to show its complications. We'd been arguing more lately, struggling to understand each other, and I'd been wondering if it was a sign we weren't meant to be together. But now, after reading my grandparents' story, I wondered if I'd been looking at it all wrong. Maybe the complications weren't a sign to give up. Maybe they were just the beginning of something real. Maybe love isn't about finding someone perfect. It's about choosing someone imperfect and building something beautiful anyway. I pulled out my phone and called him. "Hey," I said when he answered. Can we talk? I mean, really talk, not just surface stuff. I want to tell you about something I discovered, about my grandparents, and about what real love looks like, and about what I want to build with you, if you're willing to be patient while we figure it out. There was a pause, then his voice, warm and curious. I'd like that. Tell me everything. As I walked back to my car, talking to him about Dorothy and Jimmy, about war and waiting and 68 years of choosing each other, I felt something shift inside me. A new understanding, a new appreciation for the complexity of love, and the courage it takes to commit to another person for a lifetime. My grandparents' letters had given me more than just a story. They'd given me a roadmap, not for perfect love, that doesn't exist, but for real love. The kind that lasts, the kind that matters, the kind that's worth fighting for. 3 months later, I started my own tradition. I bought a box, a sturdy one, meant to last, and I began writing letters. To my family. To my friends. To the man who might become my husband someday. Letters about my life, my struggles, my hopes, my truth. Not the filtered version we show to social media, but the real, complicated, messy truth of being human. Because that's what my grandmother had given me. Permission to be imperfect. Permission to struggle and persevere. Permission to choose love even when it's hard. And someday, decades from now, someone might find my box of letters. They might read them and think, she wasn't perfect. Her life wasn't easy. But she loved well. And that's what mattered. Just like Dorothy and Jimmy. Just like the greatest love story I ever heard, the one that wasn't in any movie, but hidden in a dusty shoebox in my grandmother's attic. The one that changed everything. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Does your family have stories like this? Letters hidden away, histories untold, love that survived impossible odds. I hope this story inspires you to look, to ask questions, to preserve the truths that shaped your family before they're lost forever. And if you've been moved by Dorothy and Jimmy's journey, please subscribe to this channel. Share this story with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a comment telling me where you're listening from. I love knowing this message is reaching people around the world. Thank you for listening. Thank you for being here. And remember, real love isn't perfect. It's persistent. It's patient. It's a choice you make every single day. Just like Dorothy and Jimmy taught us. Until next time, this is Granny's Truths, reminding you that the greatest stories are the true ones.